Hi, everybody. I'm M.K. Fain.
And I'm Sasha White, and this is Identity Crisis.
So we don't have an ICYMI for you today because this week we are going to talk about the only current news that matters. And that is the story that, Sasha, you just broke about Valerie, a woman in Canada who is a survivor of the sex trade and was fired from a women's shelter for being gender critical. And you just broke this story on Plebity on Friday with a really great interview with her where she really shared so much of her background and history. So today we're going to analyze her story a little bit and dig into some of the details that share how we see it fitting in with the larger picture of women being canceled across the board for talking about this, how it relates to our own firings, and really what we are taking away from Valerie's case.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy to be at the point where I don't even feel shocked anymore at these stories. So Valerie Pelletier is a French-Canadian woman who was working at a women's resource organization. They're a very large organization. They have a women's shelter. And she wasn't working in the shelter part. She was working in sort of the stock warehouse where they have all these supplies. And she was restocking shelves and moving boxes and things like that. On the side, she's also an activist. She's gender critical. She's a radical feminist. She's a she's a survivor of the sex industry. So she has personal experience. And she wants to basically dedicate her life. She has dedicated her life to helping other women. And she has a Facebook page where she talks about gender critical issues, just like how we do on Twitter and how many women do on the internet, and unfortunately continue to face consequences for it. So one day she was at work last February 2020, and her HR manager called her into the office and said that he had gotten 2 emails, I believe, with images from her Facebook, and they were supposed to implicate her in transphobia. So yeah, in transphobia. So she tries to explain to this HR manager that, you know, she thinks that trans people deserve and need protections and rights, but that she also believes in women-only spaces and women's sex-based rights, and that she's talking about it. But she was not talking about it at work. She was not talking about it in her account in an inappropriate way. She describes herself as a elegant activist. So she was fired in this meeting. She said it was over 25 minutes. That's it. She lost her job. She didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to her coworkers. And she's just out. So this was obviously shocking to her in her life, and she decided to try to fight back. That's her nature. So she took them initially to small claims court. She was rejected by them. They denied her claim, but she's still fighting, and she is taking a case against her employer. We can't share too many of the details because it's an ongoing legal case, but she is fighting it. She refused to sign an NDA, so she's open about it. She wants to use this to try to help other women, and that's sort of the bare bones of the story.
Yeah, the part of the story that really hit me in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting was her history of being a survivor of the sex industry and how that impacted her emotional response to this firing. And she talked in your interview about getting into the sex industry as a teenager and being sort of groomed into it by her father. And it was really disturbing scenario. And then she didn't get out until she was around 23, I think she said. And what really struck me is she pointed out the irony of this man who's the HR manager, some kid right out of business school, essentially, and who's firing a woman who has rebuilt her life after struggling to get out of the sex industry, struggling to escape prostitution and stripping then later, and finally was, had a job and she was stable and not only had rebuilt her life, but was also helping women in a way that really mattered to her. And then for this man to come along and fire her from that job, which she described in I think, a very powerful way in your interview, but to paraphrase her, she essentially said, if you want to talk about violence, like, how is this not violence to rip away the livelihood of a woman who, in his mind, where does she go next? What does he think her next step is? This survivor of the sex industry. And we know how hard it is for women to escape that. We know how many times, I think it's like over 5 times on average, women try to leave the sex industry and then get dragged back in, largely due to financial instability. And I mean, Valerie, I think she is in a place where that's not where she's going to go back to. She is really in a different place in her life right now. But what does this man know about her and her life? What does he know? And he could essentially just be putting her back out on the street because she dared to write a Facebook post that he disagreed with.
So, yeah, you're making me think of the just pure bullshit of a woman being fired for a shelter that she herself would have benefited from simply because her thinking goes against the current orthodoxy, which is obviously bullshit anyway. But even if it wasn't, it's like, because of what her opinions were that she expressed, she is deemed not worthy or not safe or not able to do this job. And like you said, it's a man firing her. And in that meeting with the HR manager, he tried to tell her trans women are women. So that it's now become like a struggle session over her heretical opinions. And I just can't believe it that you can be a woman who defines woman as adult human female, and that means that you are unsafe for people to be around, or because you exist in your job, you are making it a non-inclusive environment.
Yeah, you know from your interview with her that women were being turned away at this very shelter in favor of men. And she saw at her time there, which was less than a year, she saw 4 different men who were taking women's places in this shelter when something like 10 women were turned away every single day. And there were 4 different men living there for an extended period of time, taking the bed of a woman who needed that spot when there are other men's shelters.
Correct.
And she said one of these men didn't even identify as trans, and that he was there because he would be unsafe in a men's shelter. And but what about all the women who are unsafe on the streets still tonight because a man is in her spot in the women's shelter? There is zero regard for women's safety, absolutely none. Women are nothing to these people. And the fact that the men are in charge of making these decisions makes it all the more clear. And I think that her story, more than any, really demonstrates about how women mean nothing to these people. The guise of feminism over it all, of trans women are women and my feminism is trans inclusive and I'm some progressive male who's defending the defenseless and being a voice for the voiceless. I think her case just shows more than anything that it is all bullshit. Like you said, it is absolutely all about just controlling and silencing women. They have no regard for women's safety. And if they did, there would not be a man taking a bed in a women's shelter. There would not be men firing women from working at women's shelters. It's such a thin layer over this misogyny, and yet they continue to not only get away with it, but this is the norm in these institutions now. I mean, she talked in your interview about the takeover that happened in the Quebec Women's Services. I can tell you for a fact that it's not just Quebec. Women's services that I worked with in Philadelphia, for example, equally taken over. I think we're seeing this all across the U.S., Canada, UK right now. Women's services are completely captured by misogynists who want nothing more than to control and silence and censor women.
Yes, and M.K, do you remember when the Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter was attacked by trans activists because they would not allow male counselors, and then they were stripped of their funding because of this?
Yes.
Did you hear about this, M.K? A dead rat was nailed to their door.
Yes.
I mean, this is just horrific, blatant misogynistic
with death
abuse.
Written. Yeah, there was written on the door to kill TERFs and something like that. It was disgusting. Yes, it's animal abuse in addition. I think this is a great example, if you need one, of the connection between male violence towards just anyone, really, like anyone of any species. But Yeah, and this is the threat. And I think that these shelters, the women, I mean, I'm sure that not every staff member at this shelter that fired Valerie is, actually like a misogynist, is, wants to silence women, etc. Maybe they even actually agree with her either deep down, or they know they agree with her, and they just also know that if they do agree with her publicly, that they will lose their funding, have the death threats, that their clients will now be less safe because you have these men who are coming and threatening and pinning dead animals to their door. They know the risk. And this is actually something I ran into with the women's organization that I used to volunteer for, that I was kicked out of volunteering for. They told me that the executive director told me that she agreed with me, and we had this whole conversation about how much she agreed with me, but that she couldn't support me because if she did, then either they would lose their funding, or the board would kick her out and replace her with someone who was more in line with the gender ideology, and then the funding that they put towards real important women's services would then go to men. And so this is like what people are dealing with is, the organization itself might actually genuinely want to help women, but they're stuck. And if they don't have a funding system outside of these like official systems outside of the state, then they're stuck. And so the question is, well, do you provide your services to mostly women and some men, but you still get to help mostly women? Or do you not get to provide any services? And it's really the definition of a rock and a hard place for these organizations. Although I will tell you that it's only going to continue to get worse the more they capitulate.
Right, exactly. I mean, all I want to say is like grow some balls or grow some ovaries because, and one of the things that Valerie said was, she said at the very end, I asked her, how can people support you? And she said her answer was, she's not crowdfunding. She's not doing anything like that. We are giving her a grant from the Free Speech Fund, which I'm really pleased about. But her answer was, speak up yourself. Put your face to it if you can, because that will take the burden off of me a little bit. That's what she said. She said, help me share this burden, because the fewer of us who are speaking out with our face and our name are the more the consequences will rain down on us. And I thought that was a really truthful plea. And, I don't want to put pressure on anyone to come out and do that. I've always said that people should protect themselves first and foremost, and I still stand by that. But yeah, I do think that, especially if someone is in this position of power, that they have a moral obligation at a certain point to speak out. Now, I do also want to acknowledge that men do need resources, and it, shouldn't be, how do I say this? I mean, she said it well. She said trans women she said transgender people need their rights and they need services, but, and this is a quote, an oppressed class cannot win rights at the expense of another oppressed class, and my class is 50% of the population. So the point here, if people don't sort of already have this internalized, which probably most of our audience does, that the point here is that women have a right to sex-specific services where they can go and know that there will only be women there, there will only be females there. And that's so important for a number of reasons. Valerie herself is diagnosed with PTSD from her years in the sex industry. And although she's worked with men, and she said she worked in a men's shelter where she was the only woman and she never had a problem. So this isn't a case where us women are saying, oh, we can never interact with men, or men are always doing bad things to us no matter what. We can't even be around penis. It's, it's something where not only should we be able to have shelters only for women, we should be able to do it without being harassed and abused for it and told that it's bigoted.
Yeah, absolutely. And she talked in your interview about how, she used to work at the men's shelter, and she talked about how they actually did have procedures and precautions and separate spaces for men who were at a heightened risk of violence at the men's shelter. So, we know, for example, that gay men or men who do identify as women are at a heightened risk for violence in these shelters. And so they already have separate designated spaces to ensure the safety of these men who do deserve a safe place to lay their head at night, like all people do. And yes, you're right. This should go without saying. I think if you've watched our channel, especially from the beginning, we talk a lot back towards some of our earlier episodes about laying down the basic assumptions that we operate under. Some of those including obviously that humans do have basic rights that apply regardless of whether or not they believe they have a gender identity, and the right to a safe place to live is one of those things. But absolutely, that does not invalidate the right to have the safe place to live for women. And the fact is that letting men into these spaces no longer makes them safe for women, most of whom are, women who experience homelessness are disproportionately at risk of sexual violence. Most of them are already victims of sexual violence, often from their home life or the place that they became homeless from. And so we know that the women who are in these shelters are women who are already likely just disproportionately to have sexual trauma. And now we're putting them in there with men where we're supposed to be telling them, no, disregard all of your instinct about how safe this situation is. And just trust us, this one is okay. And also that one. And also that one. And also that one who doesn't even claim to be a woman. Just trust us. These men are okay. And we know how dangerous this is. And we have seen, sadly, cases already of in women's spaces that are supposed to be separated from men to protect women for their safety, heightened populations of heightened vulnerability. We do know that men are using those spaces and then sexually assaulting women in them. And we don't know whether or not that's happened in this shelter, but we do know that that is happening. And it's to pretend that it's not, to pretend that we are fear-mongering or hateful for saying that women should be allowed to have these spaces and not have to worry about that is so disingenuous. And I think it really, again, just comes back to the fact that these people don't actually care about women, or if they do, they are prioritizing the status quo, the funding of their situation, their own job, their own livelihood, over the actual safety of the population that they are tasked to serve.
Yeah, I think if you are still on the side of trans activism and ideology, and you've heard about the Vancouver rape relief story, I don't even know what to tell you. That exemplifies so much about the two different sides of this movement. You have a rape crisis shelter that wanted to stay for females only. And they were attacked by trans activists who nailed a dead rat to their door and wrote "Die TERFs" on their door. If this isn't classic hatred of women, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, and something that Valerie said that I think also shows the inherent misogyny behind this ideology. She said, this is a quote from your interview with her, "The same people who will defend gender ideology are always pro-sex work." And in my experience, that is completely true. I'm sure there are exceptions, but it is overwhelmingly true that the people who are out there saying men can be women are also the same people who are saying, and by the way, I want to be able to buy a woman to fuck. These are the same people. And
MK, I want to put this question to you because during the live premiere of the video, the Valerie interview, people were talking in the live chat. They were asking this question: why is it that you always hear those two things in tandem? You always hear from the same crew that trans women are women and that sex work is work. And they were sort of discussing this question. And what do you think, MK? I would love to get your answer on that.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two sides to this. The first side, I think, is cultural and what issues just get kind of bubbled together. And I think that this is this is a pairing that we see just among woke, liberal, feminist, SJW types. And for most people, I think there is this just going along with whatever your in-group goes along with, that they haven't really given much thought to it, that they are pretty much just saying what they're supposed to say based on what their in-group says, and these things are already packaged together. And so I think there's obvious connections there. I said two things, but I think there's actually three. I thought of another. So the second thing being the obvious connection between a lot of people who identify as trans, specifically men who identify as trans of some type, either non-binary or as women, and the connection between that community and the sex industry, essentially, in multiple ways. So the first being the heightened risk of males who identify as females, especially in youth, in entering the sex industry. This is a known problem that young boys who are gay or gender nonconforming are, a very unfortunate increased risk of being abused in the sex industry, being prostituted and sold. And I think that often supporting sex workers it's hard to have that conversation fully without talking about the men who identify as women in that industry. And then on the other hand, there's also the side of all of the autogynephilic men who just need their porn 24/7 in order to feel like women, and that like porn and the sex industry is a almost like necessary part of that identity. And I think that there's so much conflation in both ways that are really tragic and that we need to address as a society, and in ways that are really misogynistic and need to stop. And so I think there's this conflation. And then the third thing is I think that they genuinely are both built on misogyny. And so there are people who look at things deeply in society and try to determine, are women oppressed by this or not? And then there are people who don't look at things that deeply. And so they never get beyond the surface what they're told. And so I think that, rad femmes, TERFs, and swerfs, like Valerie said that she was called a swerf before she was ever called a TERF. I think that's because we're the people who look at something, a practice in society, and say, how does this help or harm women? Who benefits ultimately at the end of the day from this? And if you apply that to both of these issues, to the sex industry and to gender ideology, you come up with the same answer, that both of them ultimately harm women. And so the people who look at things this way will end up on that side. The people who are unquestioning of misogyny at a deeper level will end up on the other side, because that is what is popular among their group. That's my guess.
Yeah. I think those are really good explanations. And I have another one that I'll kind of float and see what you think. I think that both indicate the way that to a certain class of people today, personal choice is like a god. This concept that we can just choose to be whatever we want, and that every person's choice is valid. It's kind of this inability to have a hierarchy of values as well. But on the flip side, they are imposing their values on others. Right. So it's both together. But my observation is that both of these but let people make their personal choices, relate to profit, to the profit of big business. The sex industry is a billion dollar industry in our country, the US. And the transgender industry is also shaping up to be a $1 billion industry. I don't know if it is already. I was reading about it about a month ago, so now I don't have the exact figures. It's millions of dollars in this surgery and hormones and puberty blockers and fashion advice,
training seminars.
Yes, all these things that they have going on. So I don't know. I think there's something in that both of these are very profit-based machines that if people buy into, they kind of end up having to consume and pay or be the product, one of those.
I kind of agree, but I think it's impossible to separate that from the cultural, political divide, because I think that the right has their own version of that as well, which is very choice-based and also very profit-based, and that is gun ownership. And so why does the left, that's all about choices and supposedly, according to this theory, would be driven by profit, why would they have a problem with someone making the personal choice to own a gun? And so, I'm not like taking a stance on that issue, but I think that that shows the hypocrisy of the left in this and their ideas of personal choice. Also, never mind, by the way, the personal choice of what you post on your Facebook or Twitter account, or in the case of the woman who was fired for literally having an account on Parler. Like, what about her personal choice to have an account on a different social media site? Those choices are not valid. What about a choice to vote for Trump? Is this a valid choice?
No, you get put on a list.
Right. Exactly. And so I think that you're right that they always do tend to brand it that way, that choice is empowerment, but it's always with a huge, huge grain of salt that is, but only the choices we tell you are okay, because otherwise you're probably a bigot and hateful in something.
Exactly right. I mean, it's this culture of we're all permissive, but within these narrow confines that we consider liberal. Yes. And I remembered another thing I was going to say earlier about Valerie. Her case so exemplifies this class difference here, because she was fired by this young man. Actually, I'm not sure if he was young, but as you said, he was just out of business school. Valerie is a woman who came from poverty and was, as we talked about, was prostituted when she was a young girl, a child, and had to work her way out of that. She's really smart, and she was kind of like geeky into science, and that's what got her out of it. She worked hard, she studied. She also, another thing that moves me about her is how she talked about, she's told me about, I don't know if she mentioned in the interview, that she decided to not leave her community, her neighborhood, where she's from, where she grew up. And she said she's the type of person who wants to bring her hood up with her instead of just leaving it. And she is a musician. She's a street musician. She busks, and she's friends with the homeless people, and she interacts with them. She's very much of that community. And she also, as we stated, was someone who would have benefited from the shelter. So now for this man from business school to come in here and say, because you don't buy and you won't affirm these newfangled, ridiculous ideologies that are science denying, you can't work here. We're going to take away your livelihood. We're going to take away your ability to get a paycheck because you won't say these words. And then to claim to
be the left. That is what ultimately always kills me at the end of it, is that the people doing that, exactly what you described, these elite liberals who, get all these ideas in their head from college, and they, however, he got to college, we don't know anything about this man's life. Like, maybe he also came from poverty, but ultimately he managed to get a leg up in society when she didn't. When she was the age that students go to college, she was in strip clubs and being sold as a prostitute while he was in business school. And I mean, at the end of the day, he got a degree, and she had the opportunity to get a 1-year certificate. And like, that was huge for her. And so we do see, you're exactly right, a class of people above. And it is always, because in cases of firing, we're maybe not talking about the people who own or control the means of production, but we're at least talking about, the managers, like the petty bourgeoisie sort of class, who are then firing and punishing the working class for their behaviors outside of the workplace, their freely expressed beliefs, legally and often even politely expressed opinions. And then to claim that to any degree they are progressive or the left or liberal is just more reality denial, more changing of words that used to have meaning into something that is completely meaningless now. But it never ceases to amaze me that these people consider themselves anything on the left when, I also grew up in poverty. I mean, I'm lucky that I never ended up in the sex industry, but I also grew up in poverty when I was around the age that Valerie entered the sex industry. My family was losing our home to foreclosure, and we didn't have a home after that for a long time. So, I ended up finding other ways to get by, but, I could have very easily have been someone who was in need of a homeless shelter. And the fact that then, these rich white men come in and fire us because we dare speak about our oppression, and then claim to be on the left. It is absolutely nuts. And the fact that the mainstream media right now, and now I'm going to start to sound like I'm on the right, but it's true. The mainstream media continues to paint this as a left-right issue where everyone on the left, all the liberals, all the Democrats, all the progressives are all for everything transgender. And then on the right, it's all these evil bathroom bills and sports bills to target trans kids, when the reality is that any genuine leftist would actually see this for what it is, which is petty bourgeois bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is framed as this left versus right thing to distract from the fact that it is exactly what you said, this petty bourgeois or this professional managerial class, the term that I recently learned from a book that I read called Revolt of the Elites by Christopher Lasch. And he actually wrote this book the year that I was born in the 90s. But it could apply today because he talks about how identity politics is this almost secular religion of this professional managerial class, and they use it to impose their values on other people, to make themselves feel good, to make themselves feel like their life has a purpose, because in reality so many of these professional jobs are just like spinning on a hamster wheel. They're just like circle jerking each other off with forms and contracts and whatever the fuck they're doing. So
bullshit jobs. There's another book for you.
Oh, is that a book? Bullshit Jobs?
Yes. Yes.
So that sounds exactly like the professional managerial class. They're just designed to keep this big wheel of capitalism turning, but they're not producing anything. They're not creating anything of value. But at the same time, their lives are all about their careers. Your career is supposed to bring you the ultimate fulfillment. I mean, forget the family too. That's sort of a side. We won't go off and down that one today. But they're saying that
forget the women.
Yeah, forget the women and the
that
children.
Old thing at home.
You're absolutely right. But it's also, part of it is pushing women to go into work and to have careers and bring home the same salary as their male counterparts, which obscures poverty, is what was Lasch's point here. And it's this girl boss feminism where we got to shatter the glass ceiling, but they're never talking about that dirt floor where poor women are. Because poor women don't care about shattering the glass ceiling. They care about having basic necessities met. So, this is just, it's so sickening that you can work at a women's shelter and think this ridiculous ideology of trans women are women and sex work is work, which, by the way, sex work is work comes with this set of ideas about prostitution, that it's glamorous. And when we look at media, we see how much it's been glamorized. I mean, I watched the movie Taxi Driver when I was a teenager, and it made a big impression on me. And I really see that as an important piece of art that glamorized prostitution. I mean, people always mention Pretty Women and stuff like that. But Taxi Driver, you had this teenage prostitute, Jodie Foster, and she was so cool. It's kind of sad to say that, but she looked cool. And the style that she wore is like the style that girls wear now, like short shorts and these little crop tops. It struck me that style is now everyday wear for women. And we see OnlyFans, and we see all this glamorization, all this romanticization of what they call sex work. And it's this bizarre, glitzy vision of something that's very dark the vast majority of the time.
And even if there are a few people who that is their reality, who are living this elite, high empowered life of glamour and, fully in control of what they're doing with their lives, you're right, is the vast majority, this is not the case. That over 90% of women who are in prostitution do not want to be. Like we said earlier, women often try to leave 5 times before they're able to get out. I mean, the rates of PTSD, it's no surprise that Valerie has PTSD from being in the sex industry, because the rates of PTSD for women in prostitution is higher than Vietnam War vets by magnitudes. Like, it's not just like, oh, it's like 1% higher. Like, it is magnitudes higher than Vietnam War vets. And like, this is not a job. The rate of injury, for example, like one of the most dangerous jobs in America right now is logging. Like, you don't want to be a logger, pretty dangerous job. The rates of injury in prostitution, magnitudes higher again. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me. You can find these numbers at Women's Liberation Front. We have an issue page on the sex industry that breaks down all the sources for the numbers I'm talking about right now. I'll link it below. But there's nothing comparable to an actual job. Even the most extreme jobs in our society that we do recognize as jobs, being a soldier or a logger, the actual reality of those jobs is still even much better than what women are facing in prostitution. One of the other things that Valerie said that really resonated with me is she talked about how her mission in life was not to fight this gender identity stuff. What she wanted to be doing was helping women who are victims of male violence, specifically helping women escape the sex industry. And then she ended up having to get derailed and become this gender identity warrior because this is she wasn't allowed to do the work that she wanted to do. And this is so common because a lot of times we hear people on the other side say something like, why are you obsessed with us? Why is this what you're choosing to spend your time on? And Valerie is just another example of a woman who had another mission in life that was totally derailed because of gender identity. And I really relate to that. I never wanted to for this to be my issue, even when I was tuned into it, even when I peaked and became gender critical, animal rights was my thing. That's what I was doing. I was kicked out of the animal rights movement. So because I was gender critical, and I still, honestly, I don't care about this issue to the point that you might think, given how much of my life has now become about it. There are things that I think are bigger issues in the world, really, even bigger issues that impact women. But I'm not allowed to work in those spaces anymore. I'm not allowed to confront these bigger societal issues. And so how much of women's energy in our productivity, our mission-oriented, productive women in society are being forced to fight this stupid fight that we shouldn't even have to fight when we could be out saving animals' lives or helping women exit the sex industry or saving the planet. How many of us have gotten derailed from our mission in life to basically go back to the basics? This is really what we have to fight right now, because it's so basic that without this, we can't do everything else. Without free speech, we can't do everything else. And it's just absolutely appalling, I think, that we are forced to even have this conversation, because this is not what any of us wanted to be doing.
Right. Right. And I will say that the reason that I double down on this so much is precisely because I knew that I wasn't allowed to say it. And when there's something that you are being beaten down for expressing that happens to be true, I am one of those people that I just have to keep saying it. I just have to keep shouting it. And you know what? Something else you reminded me of. Right now, we're seeing this awful situation in Israel and Palestine where both sides are getting hit, but to be clear, it's an apartheid state that actively oppresses the people living in Gaza and the West Bank. It's been described as an open-air prison that's being constantly bombed. There are women and children and men dying there. And, Hamza Watani, in our first interview, he talked about how when he first heard about gender ideology was actually as a pro-Palestinian activist in those circles. And they were infiltrated a few years ago, by gender ideology and by this woke bullshit. And he ended up leaving, even though that's one of the most important issues, if not the most important issue to him that he's expressed. So it's infecting all these other more important issues that really need our attention desperately. And I've heard you, MK, talk about before, that when your animal rights movement, you're trying to protect animals who are being tortured and kept in inhumane conditions for their entire lives. And you're being derailed to talk about these insane, ridiculous human issues.
I mean, I think that there are human issues that are not ridiculous, to be clear. But yeah, I completely agree that the fact that we are derailed from the issues that we're felt called to, that these were our missions. These were the people that we wanted to protect. This was the cause that we wanted to serve. And time again, we see good people, passionate people, experienced activists with, years and years of ground organizing experience that would honestly apply to nearly any movement, being dragged out of those movements by some stupid witch hunt. And it's time and time again, and the movements are not helping themselves. No, they're just not. It's absolutely harmful. And, I think that this, brings me to the last thing I want to mention that Valerie said in her interview with you. She said, "My free speech is all I have. And at the end of the day, I know I'm on the right side of history." And that really hit me because I completely agree with her. I think at the end of the day, all we have is our ability to speak freely and to live out our values. And that is what is at stake right now. And not just in this, broader sense of, oh, well, do you really have freedom of speech if your livelihood is at risk? In the United States right now, freedom of speech is actually at risk legally. And this is the fight. And this is why we need things like, for example, the Free Speech Fund that, I'm really glad that we're going to be able to give Valerie a grant from the Free Speech Fund. And there are so many other people, I think, who really need a service like this in order to feel like they can speak freely. And this is why it's so important.
Yeah, exactly, MK. And when we started the Free Speech Fund, it was not only to help assist people like us who were fired for our speech, but also to show other people that they can speak out because there will be support for them. Because as you referenced, this current form of social control or thought control or speech control is to go after people's jobs and their livelihoods and to deprive them of their ability to make money. And so we're really proud to be able to have this fund working. We really want all you guys to come and join us and support us. Where we basically operate, where our fund community is located, is on Patreon. If you join, you know that your money is going toward the Free Speech Fund and also toward the cost of running Plebity. If you join, you can also get early access to Identity Crisis episodes as well as other fun stuff. And something very exciting that I want to talk about right now is we're doing a promo. So the month of May, the rest of May, the second half of May, we're doing a really exciting fun promo on Plebity. If you join our Patreon, you get a mug, and we have these amazing mugs, and we have some other fun stuff as well. But the specifically, if you join Patreon, you'll get a mug, and you can go find all the details of that linked below on our Patreon page. So consider joining us. With the fund right now, we're at a point where we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. We've been raising money. We've received some generous donations, and we are ready to start giving money away. We're giving Valerie this grant, and we want to give more. Please consider joining us, and thank you for all your support thus far.
Yes, Sasha, I totally agree. It's really amazing that we're able to do this. And honestly, I'm going to have to go create another Patreon account so I can rejoin and get one of those mugs because I need to have them all.
I'm glad you said that. Current patrons can absolutely get a mug. Just send us a message with what you want, and we'll have to get your address from you.
Sasha, I would like an Identity Crisis mug, please.
You got it, girl.
All right. Well, we hope we see you all on Patreon. The link will be in the description. And be sure to also check out this week our article where we're going to go in depth into Valerie's story. And if you haven't seen it yet, you definitely want to go back and check out Sasha's interview with Valerie released on Friday where she broke this story. It really helped get the word out about what happened to Valerie because as we know, this is happening to loads of women, many of whom are not able to speak out because they do end up signing these NDAs or they don't get a platform or their lawyer advises them to stay quiet. And so we know for every one woman whose story we hear, there are probably loads more behind the scenes. Maybe you are even one of them. If you are, then please get in touch about the Free Speech Fund. There are so many different ways you can get involved and help, whether it's becoming a patron, whether it's following us, whether it's retweeting Valerie's story or sharing these videos and articles. So please do get involved. We need you. And I think that Valerie's story shows that more than ever, this fight is not over.
And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you want to let us know what you think. And catch us back here every Monday for new episodes of Identity Crisis.